Welcome to the Volpe Report podcast, the state's premier public affairs show dedicated to the topics that matter most to Pennsylvanians. I'm your host, Chuck Volpe. Join us now as we speak to this week's guest.
The following half-hour show is a paid political program and is not endorsed by this station, management, or staff.
The following program is brought to you by Excalibur Insurance Management Services.
We are pleased to welcome to this week's show Todd Shepard, the Chief Investigative Reporter for Broad and Liberty, a news and opinion outlet based in southeast Pennsylvania near Philadelphia. Todd's background as an investigative journalist is extensive, as he has been a full-time reporter for 21 years since graduating from Oklahoma Baptist University. Todd started as a general assignment reporter for KOA in Denver, where he was twice honored with the Edward R. Murrow Award. He then was rewarded for his talent by getting the call to Washington, D.C., where he worked for the estimable and influential Washington Examiner. Full confession, one of the better magazines that this host reads and stays up on the events of Washington. So that's a pretty good get. He also worked in Washington for the Washington Free Beacon. After several years, he left Washington to become an editor in his own right for the Delaware Valley Journal before taking his current position with Broad and Liberty. It was Todd's work that broke the story on the Shapiro administration's sexual harassment scandal, which was picked up, by the way, thanks to Todd's work, by both the New York Times and the New York Post. We will be discussing today the full breadth of that scandal and the potential fallout for Shapiro'S re-election bid for governor and ultimately his run for president in 2028.
This is the Volpe Report, a weekly news and political interview show examining the latest local, state, and national issues with Chuck Volpe. Insightful, informative, controversial. The area's premier political talk show, the Volpe Report.
Todd, welcome to the Volpe Report.
Hey, Chuck, glad to be here.
Well, I'll confess that I did not know a lot about Broad and Liberty. I'd heard of you, your organization, until I met Terry, your CEO, and we had a really almost a 2-hour meeting. And I was disappointed in myself that I didn't realize that you were doing the Lord's work down in the Philadelphia southeast area and in Pennsylvania at large and other national issues. And we were kind of congratulating each other that in some small way, your organization and me up here, educated people for the last 5 years at a time when they were only hearing a lie, a false narrative by network and legacy media, as well as the powers that be. Well, it was the Philadelphia Inquirer. They only told one version, the Democratic version, which wasn't. I'll give you a little sidebar here. I mentioned I was an old trial lawyer, and I tell people the oath that witnesses take before they get on a stand in trial is interesting and illustrative in a way. They don't just swear to tell the truth. They swear to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, because what they teach you in trial tactics early on, you could tell the truth and be lying. Because if you only tell half of it, it's a lie, is the point. So there were always kernels of truth in reporting. And now, in fact, the Republicans have gotten credit for winning as dramatically as they did, because it seems like your organization and my Volpe Report and all of the podcasts, and that there's an infrastructure out there that was forced to be created because no one was telling the truth in legacy media. So organizations like yours, Broad and Liberty, and me and others, the Joe Rogan podcast, all of those things, people are getting their news in different places because they felt they were being lied to. Do you feel now that the currents are finally running with your organization and you? I know I feel it is up here.
Oh, absolutely. I would say, I think when you say certain news organizations weren't telling the truth, I think what you said earlier was most apropos, where you said it's the whole truth. I think a lot of them do tell a lot of truths, but they're partial, right? We do everything we can to be fair when we've got a big story. And I think even that's a big part of the story we'll be talking about today. But, I do think that the appetites of the average American's media diet have certainly changed in the last few years, and that's a good thing.
No doubt about it. Well, now let's talk about the story today. And look, this could be Pulitzer worthy at the end of the thing. And in the headlines advertising the show, as I indicated to you, I've likened it to Watergate. Well, I'm going to liken you to Woodward and Bernstein, Todd, because not only because your credentials, as my audience has heard, are excellent, but a story that got coverage, and you're going to talk about by the New York Times, the New York Post. This was a story that was covered, but then it got its airtime, and then everybody moved on. But you stayed with it. So why don't you tell us how, and for our audience's benefit, just to give some background here, the person in question here, I won't say perp because there's no crimes that have been committed, but person, malfeasor, we'll say, was a top lieutenant and top confidant and top executive assistant to Governor Josh Shapiro, and that was his friend Mike Verb, who held top executive positions in Shapiro's administration. Mike Verb came under fire because he had been accused by, was it a number of people or just one?
Well, just one, but there has been a report in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette that there are rumors in the State House that there were more incidences, but none of them have actually ever been brought forward.
Right. And for our viewers' benefit, because of the one, now this woman who made the allegations wasn't some low-level clerk in the mailroom. You're talking about deputy secretary of a department, sub-cabinet level, if you will. And so you're talking about a high-ranking state official, woman, obviously, that had made serious allegations that she was being sexually harassed by Mike Verb. Now, I'm going to turn it over to you right now to kind of walk our audience through. Now, at this point in time, having aspired to the office of governor and having been an executive in a large company, I'm used to dealing with situations as any executive or CEO is, which means a way to deal with serious allegations that fall under the category of some sort of discrimination, hostile work environment. Sexual harassment is near the top of the list. And then you take immediate action to remove the threat and do that. So why don't you talk about what our governor did for his good friend Mike Verb when those allegations were first made?
Sure. Well, I just as a very quick, a little bit of additional background before I get to that scene setting bit is it's important to know that Mike Verb and Josh Shapiro have known each other for a long time. So they're both from Montgomery County. They both served as state representatives in the General Assembly back in the 2010s and the 2000s in the aughts in the General Assembly together. So being neighbors virtually, but it's important to point out that Mike Verb was a Republican and of course, Josh Shapiro, a Democrat, but still they sort of forged this bipartisan bond. And Mike Verb had worked for Josh Shapiro really in the same position when Josh was the Attorney General. So Verb served as his Director of Legislative Affairs. Now think about that title for a second. That's a very important position. You are the liaison between an Attorney General and the General Assembly, or you're the liaison between the governor and the General Assembly. That's a very powerful position. So Josh Shapiro gets elected in November of 2022, starts to form his administration in the winter months of 2023. They get going in January. So this young woman, she's in her mid-20s, she's hired to be a deputy in the Legislative Affairs office. Again, it's just one of the most important offices a governor has, right? So she's the deputy and she is a direct report to Mike Verb. Right. She starts in the first week of February and she lasts until the first week of March. She says in the complaint that she filed, she says he started to make petty, jealous comments like, why were you having lunch with that guy? He started making comments about her smile. You look better with glasses. And then a few weeks later, it just resulted, according to her account, was that he just outright propositioned her for sex in his office at one point. And she said she became so frazzled and anxious that she just felt she had to leave. So it's important to note here, Mike Verb's never been accused of any crimes. He's not been committed in any he's not been found guilty by any jury, and he's presumed innocent until proven guilty. But what we do know is those accusations were made in March. She quits. She files a complaint with the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, which hears those kinds of complaints. This goes on through March, April, May, and it gets settled. Essentially, the governor's office, as you mentioned, they settle for $295,000 in July.
Nobody knows. To make the case go away, right? To make it go away. And in one postscript, I said I was an old trial lawyer. When they give you the money, that means you win. And we're talking about almost $300,000. Nuisance value for our audience's benefit is like 10 or 15,000 or 20, which means you're not really agreeing with it, but it'd be more costly and you just want to do away with it. When you're talking about the cost of a nice house in a nice neighborhood, upper middle class neighborhood at $300,000, well, when you get the money, that means you win. That, if anything, substantiates her case more than anything else. But go ahead.
So, right, she reaches the settlement with the governor's office in July, I believe, or early August. Again, nobody really in Harrisburg. I mean, I think some reporters had heard some rumors, but it's definitely not in the public domain. I know that as far as us at Broad and Liberty, we got our hands on the document in early September, her complaint, basically. And we started, I immediately dedicated all of my time to it full time. And so on September 28th or 27th, I believe, that's when Mike Verb resigned. Of course, the big question here was, look, if she made these allegations in March, how could he stay on for 6 months more? And that was the big impetus of our first report. And I would say we were first to break the story because we had been working on it for a week. So at that point, about a week or two, about 10 days after the scandal first broke, Governor Shapiro'S at a press conference, he is asked about it in public for the first time. And he says, you know what, my administration is led by two strong women. And so we value women in the workplace. And he said, and we have a process, we have a procedure, and it's there to help people feel safe, and anyone can access that process at any time. I think he picked his words very carefully to make it sound like we did an investigation. It's really a question as to whether or not the Shapiro administration did an investigation, their own investigation, into these claims. And wouldn't you, if you were going to settle for $300,000, as you said, the equivalent of a neighborhood house in some neighborhood? So this is why we filed our first right to know requests in December, and then December of 23, and then March of 2024. And then those right to know requests, I don't know how familiar your audience is with open records requesting, but when the government gives you a response, you can appeal that response. And we did. We got more documents, but still we felt things had been left out, and that's why we elevated it to court. And that's how things got to where we were able to break this story in February.
Well, again, it's helpful, at least as the person asking the questions, that I have trial background and trial experience. So one of the things as a lawyer, if I were pursuing this on behalf of a client, would be a very thorough and aggressive request for information in discovery through interrogatories, through depositions. I'd ask for every document, very specifically the entire email chain between this woman and who she reported the cases to. All that stuff would be something I would be entitled to get. They'd file for orders for protection, but the judge will say, well, the prosecutor actually, to litigate this claim is a better word. They need information to prove their case. All of that would be discoverable. So the next question I want you to expound upon is, you guys would have gone after, in your right to knows, if you would specifically address how you proceeded with those right to knows, what you wanted to get and why.
Generally, I was just taking the various people. Look, in her complaint, she named about 10 people who she said, these people have have heard some of the conversations I'm referencing. They know of the many things I've detailed in this complaint. They know many of these things. So I basically took those 10 or a dozen people and I said, I'd like to see their emails for this 2-week period that mentions the accuser, or I'd like to see their emails for this 2-week period that mention workplace allegation, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I want to give you this one big caveat because it's very important for everyone listening to us to understand. I think the Pennsylvania right to know law is very strong, but there's one big, I don't want to call it a loophole, but there's one big exemption, and it's this. If you ask for documents that are part of an investigation, even if it's not a criminal investigation, government still has the right to withhold it. So this is where we really got at loggerheads with the Shapiro administration in the appeals process. Like, we just wanted to see some evidence that an investigation was done. And the Shapiro administration kept saying, no, if it's a document related to the investigation, you just don't get it. And look, I had structured my right to know to ask for other documents that might reference the investigation, but which were not a part of the investigation. If you see what I'm getting at,
Exactly right.
Like if Michelle said, sort of gossips at the water cooler through email to her friend, Sarah, and says, did you hear that there's an investigation going on? Oh my gosh, I can't believe it. That's not an official part of the investigation.
Right.
So we were hoping to capture things like that. But in the second request, the one in March, what really hit home for us was I had asked for all of the emails for essentially the last week that the young woman deputy was at work.
Right.
And we noticed that we didn't get any emails that would look like a result to that part of the request. So when we were in court, our attorney told the judge, he said, so keep in mind very quickly that the government has to attest, or they have to affirm that, hey, we've given you all that we can possibly give. So our attorney said, well, Your Honor, this affirmation that they have no emails for this deputy in a very important position, they have no emails for an 8 or 9 day period. I mean, let's be real, that just didn't happen. There were emails to that person, right? And so moments later, the governor's attorney gets up and he says, Your Honor, we take exception to this idea that there were no emails. The affidavit leaves open the possibility that the emails simply didn't exist at that time. And there were only 2 or 3 people in court. I was one of them, but I assure you, I was picking my jaw up off of the table I was sitting at because I couldn't believe that they were saying those emails no longer that they were essentially saying the emails had been deleted.
Right. They admitted emails existed, first of all, in his answer, and then proceeded to say, but we don't have them anymore. So,
Right.
So one of the things that I've read about, Todd, in the court proceedings and the coverage of this matter was that the government, and for its governmental agencies, apparently adopted a retention schedule, adopted in 2016, and it was effectively the policy that covered the deletion of records, emails, transcripts,
Right.
For, in other words, an employee that's a government official, government worker, government, in this case, high government staffer, that when she leaves government service, there's a period of time when, obviously, I know even in the private sector, I have to keep records of certain things for so long. Well, this government retention schedule that your lawyer made reference to, I want to get it right, that under G001.001 and G001.006, the retention schedule provides requirements that require, in certain cases, 8 years, and then in the other cases, 3 years, which is pretty clear. Well, in under 1 year, or thereabouts, these emails were deleted. Now, again, back to what I said earlier, if that's not a smoking gun, but I like your comment on that. And one other thing that I didn't understand in the proceeding, well, I'll get to that for a second. Let me answer the first question.
Sure. Well, look, I think you're right. And in my experience, my 4 or 5 years of experience of doing right to know requests in the Commonwealth, especially with state agencies. Many times I've asked for emails that are a year or two older, and I almost always get them. And and I think that's because of the retention schedules. So um, we certainly believe that the retention schedules were not followed. We hope to get to the bottom of this issue because we filed a petition for sanctions, and so we hope we're able to actually put people on the stand and ask them about how they adhered to the retention schedules. But I think the other key issue here, Chuck, is, and this is something our attorney brought up right on the spot in court. As soon as we heard this news that the emails no longer existed, he said, Your Honor, presumably there was a sexual harassment investigation going on here, either by the governor's office or either by the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. And he said that alone should have triggered the sort of the quarantining of these emails, pulling all of these things off and preserving them. So I think it even further erodes the notion that the Shapiro administration really tried to get to the bottom of these allegations and whether or not Mike Verb was toxic in the workplace. And again, this goes back to the question of why was he allowed to stay on for months after the original allegations were made?
Well, you're talking about Governor Josh Shapiro, former Attorney General. He kind of made his mark, made his name in his effectively prosecution of the Catholic Church, of all of those miscreant priests, despicable people that preyed upon people that because of their position of trust in sexual harassment, sexual deviant cases. And it was important for him to have conducted that investigation. I want to be clear. But in that investigation, he castigated, properly so, the Catholic Church hierarchy for effectively, once these allegations were credible that were made to at the level of bishops and archbishops in their ruling council, they didn't get rid of these priests. In many cases, they moved them to other parishes. They moved them around. They stuck around at a time when they should have been defrocked and thrown out the door immediately. Well, those were good accusations he made and part of his findings, and he was right. Well, now to turn the mirror back on him, to your point, this gentleman, Mike Verb, stays on. It seems to be because of a special relationship he had with the governor for 6 months longer than he should have been shown the door immediately. So, your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, I think your summary is correct there. The big development in that is when the Veep stakes was going on in 2024, the New York Times, they did a report on the Verb scandal. And of course, the New York Times has a little more leverage over the governor than does Broad and Liberty down in Southeast Pennsylvania. So the governor's office realized they were really in a sticky situation. And for the first time, we got some new information. And the governor's spokesperson said the governor didn't know about the allegations originally. It wasn't until much later. This is not good. This suggests that the governor didn't have a handle of what was going on with his top aide. I mean, one of his 3 or 4 top aides, right, a lifetime friend, and that he either didn't know or he didn't take action. It has to be one of those two things. Neither of those are good options. Right. When you come to the Catholic Church, I think the other thing I would bring up is he would also say, look, part of the problem with what happened with the Catholic Church was they hid behind non-disclosure agreements. Well, guess what? In this case also, we have a non-disclosure agreement.
Yeah, it's amazing. Now, let me ask you another question, and I'm going to quote right from the judge in the Commonwealth Court. And he seemed to be suggesting, even though they deleted the emails right at the site, that they may be kept somewhere else. Let me at least read what they said, and so I understand this. Basically, in the ruling, and I'm quoting now the ruling, when an individual deletes an email from his or her email account, as many people, to their chagrin, have found out, that does not mean that the email is necessarily deleted, the ruling said. Quote, those emails remain on the mail server until they are deleted in accordance with the retention schedule established by the department. Consequently, to establish that the email records do not exist, the department must also establish that they no longer exist on the mail server. Is that something that's still like a live bullet? Is something that is still available, that they may, in fact, exist somewhere?
We certainly hope so. And look, it's been my experience. I've done an open records request. This was in a different state, I admit, but I wanted to get emails that had been deleted 6 years ago. And we hired an IT expert to go back and reassemble the data, and we did it. And so, look, it's possible. And what the judge is saying in that ruling is very true.
Okay.
But I think that's exactly the kind of thing we are hoping to get to in sanctions. It may be in sanctions that the judge doesn't award us in attorney's fees, but instead says, you know what? You guys haven't even searched the server yet. I'm not awarding sanctions until you go back and search the server, which I think that'd be entirely appropriate, and it'd be within the bounds of the law, if you ask me.
And it would seem that you would therefore have authority by the ruling that they can't hide under these nonsensical. So, but nonetheless, if you get a ruling that says they have to release that an investigation shall be had into whether they exist, well, now if there's any attempt to delete, it's criminal, first of all, because now you're, after a judge rules on it, now it would be obstruction and other things. So is that an avenue you intend to pursue, I guess?
I think the main avenue we're hoping to pursue, other than just having them search the server, is we'd like some real answers on when the emails were in fact deleted, by whom, and what was their understanding of what they were doing. Did this person think, well, this young woman has left her employment, and so now we just throw email inboxes away? We want, whether we are able to question this person on the stand or get an affidavit of some kind, we want an answer to who deleted, when, and what was the thought process. And I think that that's very fair under various parts of the right to know law, and also the ruling you just cited.
Just a couple of questions. You had indicated that a formal complaint was filed with the government agency that looks into matters like this of discrimination, sexual harassment. That agency was?
Well, we didn't make right to know requests with either the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission or the EEOC.
Okay. Largely
because they do nothing but investigations.
Right.
You're not going to get any documents.
Right. That'd be covered under the investigation protection law, and they would not be able to divulge it. All right.
Exactly.
Well, first of all, Todd, I want to thank you so much for your time. This has been educational, and if I can, I'd like you to be our official, contact on this matter as it proceeds. When new things develop, because it's still ongoing, is my understanding. You haven't closed the book on this. So when something else comes up, you're going to break the story, and I hope I can read about it in some of the other newspapers, that didn't apparently cover this at all, other than the New York Times and in the New York Post you mentioned. But I'd like to call you back to keep us updated, because my feeling is, like a bad penny that keeps coming back somehow, that this thing is not dead. Watergate didn't die. It was laid to rest. I heard last rites 37 times in that matter, and it's kept alive, and it kept alive. Another witness would come forward. In this whole #MeToo era that we're in, where women have basically finally got their rights relative to the sexual harassment they dealt with, the Harvey Weinstein case and all of that. Well, yeah. My experience is, when someone has the courage to make the charge and the complaint, eventually others come forward. Eventually, things like whether they leave government service and say, you know what, I didn't talk about it at the time, but you know what, I know what happened in this case. So it might be interesting. And if anything else comes up you think of note, please let us know, because you'll be right back here, and maybe next time we can even get you in studio.
You got a rock solid guarantee on that. Absolutely, Chuck.
Keep up the good work, Todd. Godspeed. Your organization is doing a wonderful service. And we should, one other final question, I lied. I do have one more. Did you at least get attribution from the New York Times and the New York Post about who broke the story?
No, but here's a funny little thing is the New York Times realized that my right to know requests were so good and so important that they basically just sent a right to know request, and they said, we want everything he's getting. If you give documents based on his request, we want the same thing. So that tells you something.
Well, it does tell you. They piggybacked on your good work. So at any rate, again, keep up the good work and Godspeed in your endeavors, Todd. Thank you. Thanks for joining us for this edition of the Volpe Report podcast. Be sure to visit our YouTube and Facebook pages for upcoming episodes. You can catch up on the Volpe Report podcast on your favorite podcast provider.